Today we are going to explore how medieval soldiers actually acquired their war equipment, from the simplest spear to the sophisticated plate armor that defined the armored knight of the European battlefields. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Imagine a young English peasant in the 14th century observing for the first time a fully equipped knight crossing his small village. The glint of the sun reflecting off the chainmail, the polished helm that completely hid the warrior's face, the sword hanging at his waist, and the shield decorated, with coats of arms that he could not decipher. For that young man, born among pigs and barley fields, that knight seemed like a being from another world, a creature made of metal and power. What he did not know, and probably would never know, was the extraordinary financial and logistical effort required to transform an ordinary man into that walking war machine. This is the story of how medieval soldiers truly equipped themselves for war, a complex process that involved family inheritances, gifts from lords, purchases in international markets, and even the macabre act of stripping the dead on blood-soaked battlefields. The medieval era spanned approximately 1,000 years, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the end of the 15th century. During this vast period, the nature of warfare transformed dramatically, and with it, the equipment used by combatants. At the beginning of this period, body protection consisted mainly of chainmail, those intricate networks of interlocking metal rings that required hundreds of hours of artisanal work to be crafted. As the centuries passed, metallurgical technology advanced, allowing for the creation of increasingly sophisticated plate armor, which would eventually cover the warrior's body, from head to toe. Regardless of the specific era, however, one truth remained constant. Equipping oneself for war was extraordinarily expensive, and how a soldier obtained his equipment defined not only his effectiveness in combat, but often his position in the rigid medieval social hierarchy. To properly understand the challenge of equipping a medieval soldier, we first need to understand exactly what he needed to take with him to war. The list went far beyond simply weapons and armor. A combatant needed tools for the maintenance of his equipment, utensils for eating and drinking, camping materials, clothing suitable for different weather conditions, and in the case of mounted troops, all the equipment necessary for their horses. Each of these items represented a significant financial investment, and together they composed an economic burden that few could bear alone. Surviving historical records allow us to have a clear notion of the costs involved. During the 1360s, for example, a lower quality chainmail in England cost approximately 16 shillings. To contextualize this value, we need to understand that an English archer of the time earned about 4 pence per day, and there were 12 pence in a shilling. This means that basic chainmail represented a little over a month of uninterrupted work for an ordinary archer. A superior quality chainmail, naturally, would cost significantly more. Additional defensive equipment, such as a breastplate with pauldrons or a sturdy shield, could cost 25 shillings, while a full combat armor for a lance approached 80 shillings. We are talking about values that represented months or even years of work for the majority of the population. Weapons, although generally less costly than armor, still consumed a significant portion of a soldier's resources. A functional spear or sword could be acquired for approximately 2 shillings, the equivalent of about 4 days' wages for our hypothetical archer. However, just as with armor, quality varied enormously. A simple and utilitarian sword cost a fraction of the price of a blade forged by master craftsmen from renowned production centers like Toledo in Spain or Solingen in Germany. These high-quality blades, made with high-carbon steel and often decorated with elaborate engravings, could cost several pounds, values that placed such weapons completely out of reach for ordinary soldiers. Soldiers who could not afford high-quality equipment resorted to more accessible alternatives. Instead of full metal armor, a poor soldier typically wore a simple helmet, accompanied by padded clothing or clothing reinforced with thick fabrics, and carried a shield for additional protection. Offensively, these combatants relied on lower quality swords or spears, which were substantially cheaper to produce due to their relative simplicity. This type of basic equipment was often mandatory by governing authorities. In many medieval societies, there were laws that specified exactly what equipment each free citizen should possess based on their socio-economic status. A striking example of these regulations was the Assize of Arms, promulgated by King Henry II of England in 1181. This royal decree established the obligation of all free men in England to possess and carry arms in service of the king and the realm, swearing loyalty to the monarch under penalty of severe punishment, not only upon their lands or goods, but upon their own limbs. The document specified precisely the military equipment that each man should possess according to his social position and wealth. Every knight was obliged to arm himself with chainmail, a shield, and a spear. Every landowner was to possess a spear and a hauberk, a protective mail garment. Even the poorest citizens, the burgesses and free men without property, were required to keep at least a spear and an iron helmet. This universal mobilization of the armed nation was entirely at the king's disposal for the purposes of defending the kingdom. Interestingly, the Assize of Arms also established specific rules regarding the inheritance of weapons. If someone who possessed this equipment died, his weapons were to remain with his heir. If the heir was not old enough to use weapons in a time of need, the person who had guardianship over him would also have custody of the weapons, being obliged to find a man who could use them in the service of the king until the heir reached the appropriate age to carry them. This provision revealed a practical understanding that military equipment was a resource too precious to remain idle, even when its legal owner could not yet use it. As technology advanced and production processes became more efficient, equipment costs gradually decreased. By around the 16th century, an ordinary infantryman could acquire a sword much more affordably, and entire armies began to be equipped with munition armor, cheaper adjustable equipment mass-produced to clothe large numbers of infantrymen, especially the pikemen who formed the backbone of many armies of the period. However, weapons and armor were not one-time purchases. They required frequent and constant maintenance. Thus, a soldier's equipment often included items for the preservation of his weapons. This could mean something as simple as a whetstone for sharpening blades or replacement parts for damaged equipment. Most of the time, however, servants, attendants, and specialized craftsmen like armorers accompanied armies to properly perform the maintenance of war equipment that might need repair or replacement while on campaign. In addition to weapons and armor, equipment such as clothing, tents, food, drink, alcohol, ammunition, and fodder for horses were vital to maintaining military forces. Individually, these purchases could be relatively cheap, but they accumulated over time to the point of eventually exceeding the cost of initially equipping a soldier. The logistics for even small units of warriors involved significant baggage. Mounted forces, in particular, required enormous amounts of supplies for both horse and rider. Historical records indicate that an entire wagon was necessary for every 10 knights in an army, and these wagons were pulled by their own beasts of burden, which in turn required water and fodder. A basic horse cost about 20 shillings, approximately 40 days of an archer's salary, while a good riding horse could cost 10 times that amount, and a war horse even more. With this understanding of the costs involved, we can now examine how soldiers actually acquired their equipment. One of the primary ways individuals obtained weapons and armor was through inheritance. This was extremely common among the nobility, and the practice also extended to non-aristocratic families. Modern fantasy media generally portrays the process of inheriting equipment as a grand ceremony, where powerful artifacts with proper names are passed down through generations in solemn rituals. Historically, however, we see this process being much more mundane, with inheritance being specified in the clauses of rather dull legal documents and wills. After all, although weapons and armor were valuable and often richly decorated, they were also seen as practical tools with a finite lifespan. It was expected that they would be worn out or damaged in battle and require constant maintenance even when left in storage. Armories, for example, routinely hired craftsmen to evaluate and repair their stock after a campaign or battle. That said, there were some cases of inheritance that came closer to what is portrayed in fantasy media. Royal armories often housed objects of legendary status that could be passed from monarch to monarch. These precious goods could have proper names such as joyeuse, the sword of Charlemagne, which was used in the coronation of French kings. However, we must remember that this type of item was much more symbolic in nature and was not intended for use in actual warfare. Thus, for most medieval warriors, inheriting weapons was less like the passing of mystical artifacts seen in epic sagas and more like receiving a reliable hunting rifle from an elderly relative. Equipment could also be given to a warrior by people outside the family, as in the case of gifts from allies or loans from armories. Gifts of war equipment, for example, sometimes accompanied the signing of a treaty or the celebration of a political marriage. Most of the time, these gifts were exchanged between powerful figures and their subordinates. After all, it was in the interest of monarchs and aristocrats to ensure that their personal forces were equipped with adequate weapons, armor, and even horses. In the late medieval period, aristocrats increasingly began to clothe their soldiers in predetermined liveries. For example, English archers recruited in the county of Cheshire received coats that were half green and half white. The acquisition of equipment was thus concentrated in the hands of the wealthy, who bought and stockpiled large quantities of material before important campaigns. In 1295, for example, we know of a merchant who collected more than 4,000 sets of chainmail, 6,000 shields, and mountains of other equipment for a French royal campaign. However, wealthy individuals were not the only ones who served as consolidators of equipment. Cities and towns also maintained armories to arm their citizens for local defense. These stocks contained both personal items, such as weapons and armor, and larger assets like artillery and ammunition. The latter commonly came in the form of large torsion crossbows called springolds, which were fundamental to the defense of urban settlements even before the widespread adoption of gunpowder in Western Europe. But suppose war was approaching and you had neither inherited nor received as a gift all the equipment you needed. The next available option would be to buy these items. In popular media, this is usually portrayed as a buyer traveling to a single blacksmith in a small workshop. While this certainly happened in many cases, the medieval arms industry was much larger in scale, consisting of a vast international network of craftsmen, workshops, and merchants. These professionals were available to provide anything an army might need, from personal weapons like a sword or bow to massive orders of thousands of shields, helmets, and spears. The city of Milan had been a center of arms manufacturing since the Roman era. In the 14th century, there were more than 100 mail makers working in the city, and by the third quarter of the 15th century, there were more than 70 master armorers, mostly concentrated among the swordsmiths and goldsmiths around the Piazza del Duomo and the Piazza dei Mercanti. The Misaglia family, for example, produced at least 4 known armorers whose names survived in historical records, and their workshop exported armor all over Europe. The cost of weapons and armor depended on what you were looking for. A used sword, for example, could be bought cheaply for less than a day's wage for a regular worker. But a custom sword or full armor with gilding or other forms of decoration would be much more expensive. Fraud, however, was a constant problem that plagued the major production centers. What happened was that unscrupulous merchants would buy cheap armor elsewhere, then take it to a city famous for its weapons such as Nuremberg, where the item would be stamped with a fake maker's mark and sold for a profit. Cities and towns tried to protect themselves from such counterfeits, but legislation intended to punish sellers of fake products was difficult to enforce. The battlefield itself was also another important source of war equipment. In fact, weapons and armor were commonly looted from the battlefield after combat. In some cases, this could be a completely uncontrolled free-for-all. Most of the time, however, looting was an organized process to ensure that everyone knew they would receive a share of the spoils and would be properly motivated to continue fighting, instead of abandoning the combat to scavenge the dead in the middle of the battle. Generally speaking, battlefield spoils were usually supposed to be divided into shares. The general commander of the army would receive a portion, followed by the captains and their soldiers. In the late medieval period, the specific proportion of which parts a captain or commander would be entitled to was often explicitly specified in a formal contract. However, to the chagrin of the troops, an army was not always able to loot a battlefield. Archaeologists have discovered numerous mass graves from the Battle of Visby in 1361, where many soldiers were buried with their weapons and armor intact. In July of that year, the Danish king Valdemar IV invaded the island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea, a prosperous commercial center of the Hanseatic League. The Gotlandic peasants who tried to defend the island were no match for the professional Danish soldiers, and more than 1,800 were massacred in the battle before the walls of Visby. According to historian John Keegan, the hot weather and the large number of bodies, about 2,000 were unearthed 600 years later, defeated the victors' efforts to strip them before decomposition began. Archaeological excavations carried out in the early 20th century revealed a scene of extraordinary preservation. 5 mass graves were located outside the city walls. The skeletons, armor, and weapons were extraordinarily well preserved, allowing scientists to study the bones to determine the injuries the soldiers suffered. Many of the warriors were young or elderly, and most showed signs of trauma from bladed weapons. The Visby skeleton collection became the largest collection of battlefield skeletons in Europe, offering scholars a unique window into the brutality of medieval warfare. After his victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, Henry V gave specific orders on how to handle the process of looting the dead, commanding that soldiers should take armor only to supplement their own and burn any equipment that could not be easily carried. This was a necessary decision intended to keep the army mobile in the event of another attack by regrouping French troops. Thus, we have seen that medieval soldiers had many ways to equip themselves for battle. This would be easy enough to achieve for someone with a lot of money, but it proved significantly more difficult for those at the other end of the socio-economic spectrum. However, there was a surprising amount of social mobility to be achieved through warfare. Soldiers were paid based on their level of equipment. So, for example, a basic spearman would receive much less than a man-at-arms in full-plate harness mounted on a warhorse. If you inherited, received as a gift, or managed to loot enough war equipment, however, you could theoretically rise through the military ranks and, consequently, the social hierarchy. In the 100 Years' War, for example, many English archers managed to accumulate enough wealth to be able to pay for the equipment necessary to obtain employment as men-at-arms. This sudden increase in wealth and status would have translated into a literal change of socio-economic class, with huge implications for them and their families. A man who began his military career as a simple archer, earning 4 pence a day, could, through a combination of skill, luck, and opportunism, accumulate enough equipment and experience to requalify as a fully equipped man-at-arms. Earning a shilling or more a day, a 3-fold increase in his income, and a complete transformation of his social status. The armor a soldier wore was not just physical protection, but also a visible symbol of his status and resources. On a medieval battlefield, it was possible to quickly distinguish by the quality and quantity of equipment who were the most valuable targets for capture and ransom, and who were the expendable combatants whose lives had little bargaining value. Well-equipped soldiers could expect to be spared if captured, while lightly armed infantry often faced summary death if defeated. Military equipment, thus, not only determined a soldier's combat effectiveness, but also his chances of survival if he were defeated. The maintenance of this valuable equipment was a constant concern. Metal rusted if not cleaned and oiled regularly. Leather dried out and cracked if neglected. Armor joints needed to be adjusted periodically to compensate for natural wear and tear. All of this work required specialized skills and appropriate tools. For wealthy nobles, this meant employing personal armorers or having access to specialized workshops. For common soldiers, it meant developing basic maintenance skills or relying on itinerant craftsmen who accompanied the armies. When we think of the Middle Ages, we often imagine knights in shining armor, as if these imposing figures emerged completely formed from some historical void. The reality was that each fully equipped knight represented the final product of an extraordinarily complex economic and social system. From the mines where the ore was extracted, through the forges where it was worked, through the markets where it was traded, to the moment a soldier finally donned his armor and marched to war, there existed a chain of human activity involving thousands of people in multiple countries over years or decades. This was the story of how medieval soldiers actually evolved and obtained their war equipment. A story of astronomical costs and limited opportunities, of family inheritances and political gifts, of international markets and specialized craftsmen, of looted battlefields and abandoned mass graves. A story that reveals as much about medieval economy and society as it does about war itself. The game mechanisms we take for granted in our modern diversions have roots in historical realities, far more complicated and fascinating than we could imagine. If you have made it this far, it is because you share with us this fascination for history in all its complexity and humanity. Each episode we produce is a journey of discovery that connects us with the lives of people who lived centuries before us, facing challenges we can barely imagine, and finding solutions that still surprise us. If this narrative has enriched your understanding of the medieval past, consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss the next documentaries. A simple click on the like button helps our content reach more curious people like you, and your comments are always welcome, whether to share additional knowledge, ask questions, or simply tell us what you thought of this journey through the past. Together, we continue exploring the stories that shaped the world we live in today. Thank you for watching.